The air was cold, crisp, and carried the unmistakable scent of pine as I set off on my hike. I'd planned this trip for weeks, eager to explore the secluded trail that wound through the mountains. It was early autumn, and the woods were beginning to change, the leaves turning various shades of amber, rust, and gold. I had no intention of rushing. This was my time to disconnect from the world, to leave behind the noise of work and technology. Just me, nature, and the quiet. The trail was marked clearly with yellow blazes, winding through the dense forest. I had been hiking for about an hour, enjoying the solitude, when the path began to narrow and grow steeper. The climb was demanding, but I was determined to push through. Sweat trickled down my back as I hiked up the jagged rocks, my boots crunching against the fallen leaves. My pack felt heavier with each step, but I welcomed the challenge. The quiet was almost deafening, the only sounds being my labored breaths and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. At some point, I noticed something odd, an unnatural silence. It was like the forest had suddenly decided to hold its breath. The birds had stopped singing, and the usual rustling of small creatures in the underbrush was absent. A slight unease crept over me, but I dismissed it. It was just the stillness of the woods, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The trail curved sharply to the right, and I stopped to catch my breath at the bend. Looking ahead, I could see the path narrowing even more, winding between two tall rock faces that loomed like silent sentinels. There was something about the narrow pass that felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was just a feeling, a flicker of discomfort. I continued on, pressing forward, but the unsettling quiet weighed on me. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone behind me or ahead, but there was nothing. The path felt isolated now, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. I glanced at my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. It wasn't surprising. Most of the trail was in a dead zone, but it felt strange all the same. The further I went, the more I began to question my decision. This wasn't a heavily trafficked trail, but I had expected to come across at least one or two other hikers. Yet, there was no sign of anyone. The trail stretched ahead of me, empty and eerily quiet. I finally reached a clearing, a small plateau that gave me a panoramic view of the mountains below. It was breathtaking, the landscape sprawling out before me in layers of green and gold, with the peaks of distant mountains dusted with the last remnants of snow. I took a moment to sit on a large rock, removing my pack to rest. I closed my eyes for a moment, enjoying the solitude and the warmth of the sun on my face. But then I heard it, a noise from the trees, just a soft crack, like a branch snapping. I opened my eyes and scanned the tree-line, but there was nothing. The sound hadn't been loud enough to be alarming, but it was enough to set my senses on edge. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a squirrel or a bird, that I spent the next few minutes enjoying the view. But the feeling of being watched crept back into my mind. I stood up, slinging my pack over my shoulder, and began walking again, but the air had changed. It was heavier now, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the trail ahead was shadowed, even though the sun was still high in the sky. As I descended back into the forest, I noticed the trail becoming less defined, the yellow blazes harder to spot. It was as if the trail was intentionally disappearing. My heart rate picked up a little. I stopped to check my map, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I had followed the path carefully, but now it seemed as if the landscape itself was shifting, the trees growing thicker and the path more indistinct. At one point, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led down into a small ravine, while the other continued upward, twisting around the base of a rocky cliff. I checked my map again, but both routes seemed familiar. I chose the downward path, thinking it would be an easier descent. As I ventured deeper into the ravine, the temperature dropped. The trees here were larger, older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches heavy with moss. The light dimmed, as though the canopy above had thickened into an impenetrable blanket. It was strange, the way the woods had changed so abruptly, but I pressed on, eager to finish the hike before nightfall. Minutes turned into hours as I wandered deeper into the ravine, the path barely visible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. I was starting to feel the weariness of the journey, my legs aching and my mind wandering. I hadn't expected to be this exhausted. The trail seemed to go on forever, winding in ways that felt unnatural, almost as if it were leading me in circles. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just the disorienting nature of the woods. But with every step, I felt more and more lost. Eventually, I came across something unexpected, an old cabin. It was small, dilapidated, with broken windows and a roof sagging under the weight of time. The sight of it sent a wave of relief through me. Maybe there was someone here, a ranger or a fellow hiker. I approached cautiously, half expecting to find it abandoned. As I reached the door, I froze. The air felt different here, heavier, as though the very earth beneath my feet was holding its breath. I could hear nothing. No birds, no wind, nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, but I didn't dare to open it. Something about the cabin felt wrong. I turned around and started to retrace my steps. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now it was almost suffocating. I moved quickly, almost running, trying to get back to the main trail. The woods had become even more oppressive, the trees closing in tighter, blocking out the light. It was as if the forest itself was pushing me deeper into its depths. Minutes passed, but nothing looked familiar. The trail was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and tangled roots. My phone remained useless, no signal at all. My pulse quickened as panic began to set in. I had to find my way out. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on finding a landmark, anything to guide me back. Then, just as I thought I might break down, I saw a familiar yellow blaze on a tree ahead. It was faint but visible, like a distant promise of safety. I hurried toward it, breathing a little easier now. The trail was still there, just hidden beneath the thickening foliage. I followed the trail for what felt like hours, constantly scanning the trees for any sign of human presence. But there was nothing, just the quiet, the shadows, and the path that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, as the sun began to set, I reached the clearing at the edge of the forest. The sky was painted in streaks of pink and orange, and I could see the parking area in the distance. I had made it out. I don't know what happened back there, but I can't shake the feeling that the woods weren't just empty. Some presence had been with me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was something else. All I know is that I won't be hiking that trail again. The woods have a way of making you feel small, insignificant. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the forest has its own secrets. Some of them, it would be better if they stayed hidden. I'll never forget that camping trip. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything. Just me, the wilderness, and the sound of the wind threading through the trees. I wanted something quiet and solitary, a chance to clear my head after months of city noise and the relentless buzz of work. I'd read about the spot, an isolated stretch of forest in a state park that was barely visited, miles away from the main trails. Perfect. I packed light but carefully. My old but reliable tent, a sturdy sleeping bag, a small propane stove, plenty of water, some dehydrated meals, and basic survival gear. I double-checked everything. A whistle, a map, a compass, a fully charged power bank, and a satellite phone. I wasn't planning to take unnecessary risks. Still, being out there alone always carries some level of unpredictability. I wanted to be ready for anything. The drive took about 4 hours. It was the kind of trip where you watch the world change around you. The city gave way to suburbs, then to small towns, and finally to open stretches of road lined with tall pines. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the trailhead, my phone had lost service. I didn't mind. That was the point. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a GPS app on my phone to back up my map and compass. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The first few miles were easy enough. The trees were dense, and the forest floor was covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air smelled rich and earthy, the way it does after a rain. Every so often, I'd hear the rustle of something small darting through the undergrowth, probably a squirrel or a bird. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, just me and nature. I hiked for about 3 hours before I reached the spot I'd picked on the map. It was a small clearing near a shallow creek, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent on a flat patch of ground and laying out my gear inside. The creek was close enough that I could hear the water trickling over the rocks, a soft, soothing sound that made the place feel even more peaceful. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, sat by the small campfire I'd built, and watched the stars come out. The sky was so clear that I could see the Milky Way stretching overhead, a ribbon of light cutting through the darkness. It was beautiful. I stayed up later than I'd planned, just sitting there, listening to the forest and staring at the stars. Eventually, the chill of the night drove me into my tent, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I followed the creek for a while, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. It was slow going, but I didn't mind. The forest was alive with sound. Birds calling to each other, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I saw deer tracks near the water and even spotted a small herd grazing in a meadow farther upstream. They looked up when they saw me but didn't run. I'm not sure why, but that moment stayed with me. It felt like I was part of the forest, not just passing through it. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. I made dinner and settled in for another quiet evening by the fire. That's when I noticed the first thing that felt off. It wasn't anything big, just a small shift in the atmosphere. The forest, which had been so full of sound all day, was suddenly quiet. Not completely silent, but subdued. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth seemed to have faded away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had shifted, or maybe I just hadn't noticed the change until now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I stayed up later than I had the night before, listening to the quiet and watching the shadows deepen around my camp. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling, the snap of a twig, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid and went to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, heart pounding. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was silent, the kind of deep, oppressive silence that presses against your ears. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing, and then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere outside the tent. It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. I froze, straining to identify it. Sounded like breathing, slow, steady, deliberate. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too regular, too deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then it stopped, just like that. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I lay awake for the rest of the night, listening, but the sound didn't return. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, every nerve on edge. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I'd heard. I spent the day trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. I went for another hike, kept busy with small tasks around camp, but the feeling lingered. That night, I built the fire a little bigger and kept it burning longer. I stayed up as late as I could, but eventually, exhaustion got the better of me. I crawled into my tent, telling myself that the forest was just playing tricks on me, that I'd imagine the sound. I woke again in the middle of the night. This time, there was no mistaking it. The breathing was back, louder now, more insistent. It was right outside the tent. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, and fumbled it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent, but I didn't dare open the flap. The breathing continued, slow and steady, until, just like before, it stopped. When the sun came up, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling with every movement. The forest felt different that morning, heavier somehow. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to the car was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, following me. But the trail was empty, the forest as still and silent as it had been the night before. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to my knees. I threw my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, the forest far behind me, that I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But part of me doesn't believe that. Part of me knows there was someone, in those woods that night. I'll never go back to find out. I've always preferred solitude. There's something about being away from people, surrounded only by nature and your thoughts, that feels right. I grew up in a small town, and even though I moved to the city a few years ago for work, I always found a way to return to the familiar silence of the woods whenever I could. Something about it calms me, makes me feel at peace in a way nothing else can. So, when I had a few days off, I decided to take a solo trip into the woods again. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. Just me, my backpack, and the untouched wilderness. No phone signal, no distractions. I've done this countless times before without issue. But this time, things felt different from the moment I stepped off the trail and into the woods. I parked my car at the base of the mountain, where the road turns into a narrow dirt path. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I checked my bag again, making sure I had everything I might need. A tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a map, a flashlight, and extra batteries. The essentials. The air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and I started walking deeper into the forest. The trail wasn't difficult, but it was steep in some places, and as the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long and stretched across the ground like dark fingers. I wasn't worried, this was my element. I was used to it. I walked for hours, enjoying the quiet, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call. I had a general sense of where I was going, a small clearing about 5 miles in that I loved camping at. But as the light began to fade, I started to realize something strange. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the entire place had quieted down for some reason. Even the wind, which usually rustled through the branches, was eerily still. I checked my watch, it was getting late. I knew I wasn't far from the clearing, but something about the atmosphere felt off. I quickened my pace, but the stillness seemed to follow me. The further I went, the more uncomfortable I became. The woods felt too empty. Finally, I reached the clearing. It was a small, flat area with a ring of trees surrounding it, and it always felt safe, like it was a place where the outside world couldn't reach me. I set up my tent quickly, barely noticing the cold or the quiet anymore. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and darkness had settled in completely. I lit my lantern, then sat outside for a while, staring into the flickering flame. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a distant rustling in the trees. I thought it was just the wind picking up, so I ignored it. But the rustling didn't stop. It got louder, like something was moving through the woods, heading in my direction. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was walking through the underbrush, twigs snapping underfoot. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The woods were supposed to be empty. No one came out here this deep into the wilderness, especially not at night. I was sure of that. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but trees, their tall, dark shapes looming in the distance. The sound of footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a moment, I thought maybe I was just imagining things. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a person, or at least it looked like one, emerged from the trees. It was tall, thin, and oddly shaped, almost as if it wasn't fully standing upright. I couldn't make out any details at first, just the silhouette of someone moving slowly toward me. The flashlight's beam bounced off the figure's form, but it didn't seem to illuminate it fully. It was as though the light couldn't reach it, or it absorbed the light instead. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? But there was something strange about the way it moved, unnatural, stiff, like it was dragging its legs behind it. And the way it was slowly approaching, it wasn't like someone walking toward me. It was deliberate, methodical, like it had all the time in the world. I felt a chill run down my spine. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, crept into my mind. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any noise except for the sound of its footsteps. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. My mind raced. It was too far to run, and I wasn't about to make the first move toward it. I had no idea what it was or what it wanted, but there was a gut feeling telling me not to approach. I backed up slowly, then turned and bolted toward my tent. My breath was sharp, ragged in my chest as I scrambled to get inside, fumbling with the zipper as my hands shook uncontrollably. Finally, I managed to get it shut. I collapsed against the side of the tent, heart racing, every muscle tense. Outside, the figure didn't follow immediately. I listened, trying to hear any sounds. Footsteps, breathing, but it was silent. Too silent. The only sound was the rush of blood in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and eventually I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight again, but as I unzipped the tent and poked my head out, I found nothing. The clearing was empty. I waited. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. There was no way that figure had just disappeared. Then I saw it again. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the trees. But this time I could see it clearly. It was a man, at least it looked like a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow, empty eyes that stared straight at me. His expression was blank, emotionless, as if he wasn't aware of me, but at the same time, he was staring directly at me. I froze again, unable to move, unsure if I should scream or run. I thought about reaching for my phone, but I realized it wasn't in my bag. My heart hammered, my breath shallow and fast. I couldn't look away, couldn't stop staring into those dark, empty eyes. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't know why, but I felt a strange urge to follow him. A sick curiosity clawed at me, urging me to leave the safety of my tent and venture into the dark forest after him. But I didn't. I stayed put, frozen in place. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. The woods were empty again, just as they should have been. The sun rose over the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed up my things quickly, not bothering to enjoy the usual calm of the morning. I didn't feel safe anymore, and I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. I made my way back down the trail, trying to ignore the strange feeling of being followed, of something watching me just out of sight. It wasn't until I reached my car and started driving back toward the town that I felt like I could breathe again. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw something move in the woods behind me. I never went back to that place. Maybe I'll never understand what happened, but I don't need to. Some things are better left unexplained. All I know is that the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem, and sometimes there are things out there that don't belong. I was looking forward to this hike. There's something about nature that always calms me. Long stretches of forest, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the freedom of just being alone with your thoughts. This trail, a moderately difficult one, was supposed to take me through some of the most scenic parts of the area. I'd read about it in hiking forums and seen pictures of the towering trees and sprawling views. It seemed perfect for a weekend trip. Just me, my pack, and the open trail. It was an early Saturday morning when I set out. The sun had barely risen, casting soft rays over the distant peaks. I was used to getting up early for hikes. It's when the air is freshest and the trail the least crowded. My backpack felt light, though I had packed all the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map. I always made sure to be prepared, even for unexpected situations. The weather was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures. Nothing about the morning seemed off. The path started wide and smooth, winding through an area of thick trees. The air smelled earthy, rich with the scent of pine and damp soil. Birds chirped above, and every now and then, I'd hear a rustling in the underbrush. Likely squirrels or deer, nothing out of the ordinary. I walked at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude and the slow immersion into the forest. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew taller and the forest denser. It felt quieter here, as if the world outside had fallen away. The only sounds were the occasional creak of a branch and my footsteps crunching along the gravel. I looked at the map on my phone. There was a fork coming up in about half a mile. It would be my first real decision of the hike, and I'd already decided I was going to take the less traveled path. Something about it called to me. It wasn't a difficult route, but fewer people seemed to take it, and that made it more appealing. I preferred quiet, peaceful hikes over the more popular routes that were often crowded with groups. When I reached the fork, I followed the smaller path, which veered off to the right. Almost immediately, the trail became steeper. The trees grew thicker, blocking out more of the sunlight, and the ground was covered in loose rocks and fallen leaves. The climb wasn't hard, but it was a bit of a workout. Sweat began to bead on my forehead as I pushed onward. The higher I went, the more the trail seemed to wind around the mountain, and the deeper I ventured into the woods. About an hour later, I stopped for a quick break. I sat on a large rock, sipping water and catching my breath. My phone showed no signal, no surprise, considering how far off the beaten path I had gone. I didn't mind, though. The isolation felt comforting. It was only then that I realized how silent everything had become. Normally, on a hike like this, you'd hear the occasional breeze rustling through the leaves, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. but now it was eerily quiet. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no noise, just stillness. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just part of the deep forest atmosphere. I stood up, stretched, and continued walking. The trail began to get rougher as I ascended, and I had to pay more attention to where I was stepping. I was still in good spirits, enjoying the challenge. The climb became steeper, and soon I was scrambling over loose rocks, using tree roots to pull myself up. There was a part of me that wondered if I should have stuck to the main trail, but I pushed those thoughts away. This was what I'd come for, this sense of raw adventure. After another hour or so, I noticed something strange. I wasn't sure what it was at first. It was a shift in the air, something subtle, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped, looking around. The forest was still as silent as before, but now there was a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a subtle unease, a whisper of something just beyond my sight. I shook it off again, trying to focus on the trail ahead, but the feeling lingered. I continued upward, the incline becoming more challenging. My legs burned with effort, but I was determined to make it to the top. The higher I got, the harder it was to see the trail clearly. It had become a jumble of loose rocks, tree roots, and thick underbrush. The canopy above had thickened, blocking out more light, and soon, the trail became little more than a faint path through the forest. I checked my map, unsure if I was still on the right track. It was hard to tell. I was so far into the wilderness now that the landmarks I had hoped to rely on had disappeared. At some point, the trail seemed to fade completely. I stopped again, trying to get my bearings. My heart was beating a little faster now, not from exertion, but from something else. I glanced around and realized that the silence had deepened. The air felt thick, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I decided to retrace my steps, thinking I had missed a turn or wandered off course. As I backtracked, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees made me pause and look around. But I saw nothing. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it just my nerves? Or was something out there? Maybe I was just being paranoid. Still, the unease wouldn't leave me. I pushed forward more cautiously now. It wasn't until much later that I realized I had lost track of time. The sun was low, and the light was fading fast. I hadn't made it back to the fork I'd passed earlier. Something wasn't right. The woods were eerily still, and my phone had been dead for a while now. I had no way of calling for help, no way to orient myself. Panic set in slowly. I tried to focus on the trail, looking for any familiar signs, but everything felt foreign. The trees, the rocks, the path, nothing looked the same as before. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I knew it was easy to get disoriented in the woods, especially when you're this far off the main trail. I could still hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I walked faster now, hoping to stumble across a clearing or some sign of civilization. But then, as I rounded a corner, I froze. Ahead of me, just at the edge of the trees, there was a figure. It was tall, thin, and completely still. Couldn't make out any details. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could have been a tree or just the light playing tricks, but it didn't move. It was as if it were waiting. For what felt like forever, I just stared, too afraid to move. Then the figure took a slow step forward. I gasped and stepped back, heart racing. I was alone. There was no one else out here. I turned quickly, scrambling to get back to where I thought the trail had been, but I wasn't sure anymore. Every direction looked the same. My mind raced, thoughts swirling in a panic. The sun was almost gone now, and darkness was setting in. That was when I heard the voice. Faint, distant, and barely audible, but it was definitely there. "Hey!" I spun around, but saw nothing. My chest tightened. I wasn't sure what to do. I needed to get out of here. I turned back to the path and ran, slipping on rocks and roots. I didn't look back. My breath was ragged, and the fear was overwhelming. My heart thudded in my chest as I forced myself forward. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled back into the clearing where the fork had been. My legs were shaky, and I collapsed onto a nearby rock, gasping for air. I couldn't hear anything now. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. The oppressive feeling was gone. I checked my watch. Just over 3 hours had passed since I had started this whole ordeal. Somehow, I had been lost for hours when it felt like minutes. The hike out was uneventful. The forest seemed ordinary again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It was the longest hike I'd ever taken, and I couldn't explain what had happened or why I'd gotten lost. I didn't want to dwell on it, but when I finally reached the parking lot, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. I was safe back where I belonged. It wasn't until later, as I was looking through the photos I had taken during the hike, that I noticed something strange in one of the pictures. A shadow in the background, just behind a tree, where no one had been when I took it. It made my blood run cold. I deleted the photo immediately. Some things were better left unexplained. I never should have gone on that hike alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my boots, and the mountains. I had been planning it for weeks, thinking that some solitude in the wild would be the perfect escape from the stress of work and city life. I chose a trail that wasn't too well known, the kind of place where you could feel like you were the only person on Earth, the perfect way to recharge. The morning I left, the weather was clear, a bit chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. The trailhead was just off the main road, and as I parked my car, I was met with the usual mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with starting something new. I checked my pack one more time, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map. I knew the trail, at least the general layout of it, so I didn't expect to get lost. Still, I always like to be prepared. I locked the car and set off, breathing in the fresh, crisp air. The trail started out easy, winding through thick trees, their leaves already starting to turn amber for the fall. The air smelled earthy, like damp soil and pine. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the gravel path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few miles were nothing unusual. The trail dipped down into a small valley, following a creek that twisted through the trees. It was quiet, with just the sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird call overhead. I stopped a few times to take pictures, admiring the landscape, but each time I looked around, something seemed off. The woods felt dense, too dense. The trees crowded in on me, their gnarled branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. I shrugged it off, though. It was just my imagination, I thought. About halfway through the hike, the trail became steeper, leading up toward a rocky ridge. I had read that the view from the top was breathtaking, and that's what kept me going. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I welcomed the physical challenge. I was in good shape, and this was exactly what I needed to clear my head. That's when I noticed something strange. I'd been walking for hours, and the trail was starting to feel unfamiliar. The path was narrowing, becoming more overgrown. The usual trail markers were sparse, and I started to wonder if I had missed a turn somewhere. I checked my map, but it didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. The contours of the land were wrong. I couldn't figure it out. I stood there for a moment trying to get my bearings. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of nature dimming as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to press on, hoping the trail would open up again. But it didn't. It just got worse. The path became more and more difficult to follow, the ground uneven and slippery from the morning dew. I found myself scrambling over rocks and fallen branches, my heart rate picking up as the trail seemed to disappear entirely. At this point, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. It was as if the forest had closed in around me, trapping me in a maze with no way out. I should have turned back then. The thought crossed my mind, but something kept me going. Maybe it was the idea of the view at the top, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I had gotten myself into a situation I couldn't handle. I kept moving, pushing through the underbrush and ignoring the creeping sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. There was something else, something wrong. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a cliff, the rocks jutting out sharply toward the sky. It was a view, but not the one I had been expecting. The mountain peak was still out of reach, and the dense forest stretched endlessly behind me. The silence was oppressive, and it was as though the entire world had stopped. I looked around, trying to get a sense of where I was, but everything seemed unfamiliar. That's when I realized I had made a mistake. I'd taken the wrong path. Somehow, I had wandered off the main trail into an area that was rarely visited. I had no idea how far I had gone or where I was in relation to the trailhead. My phone had no signal, of course. I felt a wave of panic rush over me. This wasn't just a misturn or a minor detour. I was lost, and worse, I was alone. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a cold, golden light. The woods felt different in the fading light, darker, more threatening. I knew I had to get out of there before it got completely dark, but the thought of retracing my steps felt impossible. The trail was barely visible now, and with every step I took, the dense forest seemed to swallow me whole. I started moving again, hoping to find some sign of the trail or any recognizable landmarks. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I tried to remember my surroundings, any distinctive features of the landscape that might help me find my way back, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. Nothing stood out. I began to feel the weight of panic rising in my chest. My heart was pounding in my ears. I couldn't keep moving like this. I needed to stop and think. I found a small clearing and sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing. I pulled out my map again, but it was useless. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted, become something I didn't recognize. As the light faded, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the chill of the night air sank into my bones. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay put and hope someone would come looking for me, or keep moving and risk getting even more lost. I opted for the latter. Felt like my only option. I picked a direction and forced myself to walk. The darkness pressed in on me like a weight, and I stumbled over roots and rocks in the growing gloom. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a ghost or some supernatural presence. It was just the primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. Couldn't explain it, but I felt it deeply. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a light. It was faint at first, just a small glow in the distance, but it was enough to give me hope. I hurried toward it, my legs burning, my breath shallow and fast. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire or someone else's flashlight. It was the last remnants of daylight, barely visible through a break in the trees. And just beyond that break, I saw the trail. A small sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the turnoff to the main trail. I followed it without hesitation, my legs shaky but driven by the overwhelming need to get out of the woods. I kept my focus on the trail, ignoring the growing darkness around me, until finally, after what felt like hours, I made it back to the main path. Relief flooded through me, so intense that it almost brought me to my knees. I looked around, the familiar trees and rocks no longer feeling ominous but like old friends. I knew exactly where I was now. The end of the trail was just a few miles away. By the time I reached the trailhead, the stars were out, and the night air was crisp and cool. My car was waiting for me, a beacon of safety. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just got in, started the engine, and drove off without another thought. I don't know what exactly happened out there, but I know I'll never go hiking alone again. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how easily you can become lost in a place that's supposed to be peaceful. That forest isn't some tranquil escape. It's a place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. And as I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my head: I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. It's funny how easily people can get lost, even when they think they know exactly where they're going. I've heard people talk about it all the time. I'll just take this shortcut, they say. It's faster, it'll save me time. What they don't realize is that shortcuts often lead to unexpected places, and not always the ones you'd want to find. I never thought it would happen to me, though. I mean, I'm not the type of person who gets lost. I'm a practical guy. I've done a lot of traveling, road trips, camping, hiking, and I'm good with directions. Or at least I thought I was. The whole thing started when I decided to take a different route home from work one night. It was late, maybe around 10 p.m., and I was tired. My usual route was always the same: the highway to the main road, past the gas station, then a right turn onto a small country road that would take me home. That night, though, something told me to try a shortcut. Maybe I was too eager to get home. Maybe it was because I'd seen a sign for a new road that promised a faster route, or maybe it was just a whim. Whatever the reason, I ignored my instincts and turned onto the new road. First, everything seemed fine. The road was narrow but well paved, and there was barely any traffic. I passed a few houses, some old barns, and a couple of rusted cars parked in front of weather-beaten trailers. Everything seemed pretty normal for the middle of nowhere. The air was crisp, and the quiet of the night was unsettling in a way that made my skin prickle. But I didn't think much of it. After all, I'd been on roads like this before. I drove for what felt like an hour. The farther I went, the more the road twisted and turned, narrowing and fading into a gravel path. I noticed how much darker it was out here. There were no streetlights, no signs of life. Just me, my car, and the headlights slicing through the blackness. A few trees leaned over the road, their branches making eerie shadows that danced in front of my headlights. It didn't bother me at first. I figured the road would open up again soon, like every other shortcut I'd taken in the past. But the more I drove, the more I realized this wasn't just a shortcut. It was an isolated path leading somewhere far from civilization. I checked my phone. No service. Of course, I always forget that out here the signal's spotty at best and non-existent at worst. But it wasn't a big deal. I had enough gas. I knew the general direction of where I was headed, and there was no reason to think anything could go wrong. Then I saw it. A turnoff just ahead. It wasn't marked by any sign, and the road looked even more overgrown than the one I had been on. A small wooden post stuck out from the grass, half-rotted and barely noticeable in the dark. But something about it caught my eye. It seemed off. A chill ran through me as I slowed the car and approached it. The road curved, and I could just make out a small trail leading into the trees. The kind of trail that no one ever uses anymore. The kind that seemed almost like it was begging not to be followed. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned onto that road. I kept driving slowly, hoping that I'd find a clearing or something to break the dense woods surrounding me. The trees closed in tighter as I went on, their branches nearly touching my windshield. It was suffocating. The air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. The silence was almost too quiet, if that makes sense. There wasn't a sound. No animals, no wind rustling through the leaves. Nothing. I should have turned back, but I didn't. The road didn't seem like a road at all anymore. It was more of a rough path, a muddy trail that could barely fit my car. The headlights flickered a few times as I hit potholes and uneven patches of dirt. The further I went, the more it felt like the world around me was closing in. There was no sign of life, no houses, no barns, nothing. Just trees and shadows. And then I saw it. A house. It was small, old, and crooked. The kind of house you'd expect to find in a horror story. Run down with peeling paint and sagging walls. It sat just off the road, hidden by thick bushes and trees. There was no driveway, no signs of activity, just this abandoned-looking place in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't understand why anyone would live out here, let alone build a house like that. I pulled over and sat there, staring at it for a few moments, unsure of what to do. The air was thick with an unsettling calmness. Something felt wrong about this place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I thought about just driving away, but I was too curious. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be behind that house. Maybe it was just some forgotten relic of the past. Maybe it had an interesting history. Maybe it was just abandoned. But even that seemed strange in a place this remote. Eventually, I decided to take a quick look. What harm could it do? It was late, but I wasn't too far from civilization. I could always turn around if I felt uneasy. I locked my car, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and started walking toward the house. The closer I got, the more I could make out. The roof was half collapsed, the windows boarded up, and the door sagged on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. Still, I had to know. I had to see it up close. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the silence. Inside, it was dark, but the flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing dust-covered furniture, broken glass, and what appeared to be old papers scattered across the floor. It looked like someone had lived there at some point, but they'd left a long time ago. There was no sign of life, no fresh footprints, no indication that anyone had been there recently. And then I saw it, a photo partially hidden under a pile of debris. I bent down to pick it up, and as I did, my stomach turned. The photo was old, faded, and yellowed with age. It showed a family, man, woman, and 2 kids. They looked happy, smiling in front of the house, but there was something off about their eyes. Their faces seemed too blank. Too empty. I stood up, holding the photo in my hand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I heard a faint sound, a rustling noise from behind me. I froze. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing. But then I heard it again. A soft thump, like something heavy being moved, coming from upstairs. I don't know why I didn't run at that moment. Maybe it was just shock. Maybe I was too curious. Whatever it was, I stood there for a few more seconds, trying to convince myself that it was just the house settling, that it was nothing. But then I heard it again, a louder thump, and then another. It was coming from above me from the 2nd floor. That was when my instincts kicked in. I didn't even think. I turned and bolted out of the house. My heart was pounding as I ran back to my car, hands shaking as I fumbled to open the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, gasping for air. I could feel my pulse in my neck, my whole body tense with adrenaline. I started the engine and peeled out of there, kicking up gravel as I sped down the path, my headlights bouncing wildly through the trees. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, miles away from that house. I never went back, and I never spoke about it to anyone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. If I'd gone upstairs. What did I hear? Was it just the house? Or something or someone else? I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. I had always wanted to spend some time alone, away from the noise of city life, just me and the woods. So when I found a secluded cabin to rent for the weekend, I thought it was the perfect opportunity to disconnect, get some peace, and maybe even clear my head. The cabin wasn't much, small, tucked away on the edge of a forest, but it had everything I needed. There was something about it that felt right. Felt like a place where I could breathe, just be myself. The first day was great. The sun was shining through the trees as I unloaded my things from the car. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the sound of birds was calming. The cabin was simple. A wooden structure with a few rooms, a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a loft upstairs. The floors creaked with every step, the way old wood does, but that only added to its charm. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, and just stared at the view for hours. That evening, I decided to take a walk. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest around the cabin seemed to come alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. The path near the cabin wasn't well maintained, but it was easy to follow. I kept to it, letting my mind wander, taking in the quiet, the isolation. It was peaceful, but as I ventured deeper into the woods, something began to nag at me. Just a small feeling, almost like I was being watched. I brushed it off. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. There was no one out here, or at least that's what I thought. When I returned to the cabin, it was dark, the moon hanging high in the sky, casting shadows across the yard. The wind picked up, making the trees sway in strange patterns. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The inside of the cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the fireplace. I could hear the wind outside picking up speed, causing the wooden walls to creak. The place felt alive. I figured it was just the old wood settling. As I sat by the fire, I began to hear a strange noise, a soft thud, like something tapping against the cabin's walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, maybe a branch brushing against the house. But then I heard it again, closer this time, more deliberate. My heart started to race. The fire crackled louder, and I glanced at the windows. Nothing. I tried to shake it off. I stood up, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and looked around the room. Everything was normal. I was just getting paranoid from being alone too long, I told myself. But the noise didn't stop. It continued, tapping against the side of the house like something or someone was gently knocking over and over again. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands shaking slightly, and stepped outside onto the porch. The wind had died down, and the air felt still, almost too still. I shone the beam of light across the yard. Nothing, no movement, but that nagging feeling, the feeling of being watched, was back. I stood there for a long time, listening, my pulse pounding in my ears. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was just being ridiculous. It was probably just an animal, a bird or a squirrel knocking on the cabin. But when I went back inside and tried to sleep, the sound continued.
Top, top, top.
Soft but constant. I covered my head with a pillow and tried to drown it out, but I couldn't. By the time morning came, I hadn't slept at all. I was exhausted, jittery, and had no idea what to make of what had happened. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The wind, animals, my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something I wasn't seeing. I spent the next day trying to push it out of my mind. I went for another walk, this time further into the woods, but the forest felt different. The trees were too quiet. There were no animals, no birds chirping, nothing. The silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing, just the trees, the dirt, and the emptiness. By the time I made it back to the cabin, my nerves were shot. I decided to leave. I wasn't sure why, but the thought of spending another night there had become unbearable. The place, which had seemed so peaceful and inviting when I first arrived, now felt claustrophobic, as though the walls were closing in on me. I gathered my things quickly, ready to get in my car and drive far away. But when I reached the front door, I froze. It was wide open. I was sure I had locked it. I always lock doors behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, flashlight raised, heart hammering. The room looked untouched. The fire had gone out hours ago. I was alone, but the feeling of unease in my chest had turned into something much worse. Pure dread. I checked every room, the closets, the loft. There was no one. But then, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the kitchen, next to the pantry, was a small, hand-carved figurine. I hadn't seen it before. It was simple, unassuming, a wooden figure of a person with hollow eyes. The carving was rough, jagged even, and it looked as though it had been made in a hurry. I didn't know why it felt wrong, but it did. It felt like someone had been in here and they had left that thing behind as a message. That's when the tapping came back.
Top, top, top.
Louder now from behind the walls. My heart leaped in my chest as I spun around, searching the room for any sign of movement. The tapping came from the ceiling now. It was like someone was pacing up there, stepping across the floorboards in the attic. I ran to the stairs, my legs like lead, and shone the flashlight up into the dark loft. There was nothing. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone else could have been in the cabin. I had locked the door. The only possible explanation was, well, I didn't know, and the uncertainty terrified me. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my things, left the figurine on the floor, and ran outside into the woods, back to my car. I didn't even care about the cost of the rental at that point. I just needed to leave. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never went back to that cabin. And every time I think about it, I remember the feeling I had that night, the feeling of being watched, the tapping, the figurine. I don't know who or what was there or what it wanted, but I don't ever want to find out. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just a short drive to get away from the noise, the constant buzz of the city, the stress of work. I found the cabin online. The listing said it was remote, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. The pictures were beautiful, just the kind of place I thought I could relax and clear my head. A cozy log cabin surrounded by dense trees, a small lake nearby, and a sense of isolation that I thought would be refreshing. It seemed perfect for what I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. The GPS kept cutting out as I got deeper into the woods, and the road became less of a road and more of a dirt path. The trees were thick, their trunks so close together that it felt like I was driving through a green tunnel. I hadn't seen another car in hours. The air smelled different here, fresher, but also damp, like the earth had been soaked for days. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I felt like something was watching me, but I brushed it off. My mind was just playing tricks. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Rustic, charming, with a small porch that overlooked the lake. It was the kind of place that felt like it was stuck in time. I could hear the soft chirping of crickets, the rustling of the trees, and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I unpacked my car and brought in my things. It wasn't long before I had the fire going inside and the cabin felt warm. I could hear the crackle of the wood as the flames danced. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into one of the armchairs by the window, watching the sun begin to set over the water. It looked like the kind of sunset you only see in pictures, pink and orange streaks across the sky. For a moment, I thought maybe this weekend would be just what I needed. As night fell, the air grew colder. The only sounds were the fire in the hearth and the occasional gust of wind outside. I wrapped myself in a blanket and turned off the lights, letting the fire provide the only glow in the room. I could hear the wind howling through the trees now, a constant low moan that seemed to shake the walls. It didn't bother me at first, but as the hours wore on, it started to get to me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bed was comfortable, the sheets cool against my skin. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind outside was louder now, and every now and then I thought I heard something scratching at the walls, just soft enough that it could have been the trees rubbing against the cabin. Still, the sound made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no reason to be scared. Yet, the sense of isolation felt heavier now. The idea that there was nothing around for miles, the nearest town was an hour away, the nearest person even further. It was quiet here, too quiet. It made me feel exposed, like I was too far from safety. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it didn't last long. The sound of something scraping at the window woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it, sharp, deliberate, like fingernails on glass. My heart started pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it felt close, too close. I got out of bed and crept to the window, my pulse racing in the silence. Outside, the trees were dark shadows, the night swallowing up everything beyond the porch. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the lake shimmered faintly, reflecting the little light that made it through. But there was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or some other small creature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to lock the windows and double-check the doors, just to be sure. When I did, I noticed something strange. There was dirt on the doorknob, like someone had been standing there, pressing against it, but I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard any footsteps. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. The noise outside had stopped, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, trying to calm my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, the image of that dirt on the doorknob kept coming back. In the morning, I went outside to clear my head. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. The lake looked peaceful, and the trees were still. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the mud leading up to the porch. They weren't there the night before, I was sure of it. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking around the cabin for hours, pacing back and forth. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just that there were footprints, it was the fact that they were fresh. No one had passed by here in days. I hadn't seen anyone, I hadn't heard anyone. And yet here they were, large, heavy prints in the soft mud. I backed away from the porch and stood still, trying to think. My phone had no signal, of course. The cabin was supposed to be off the grid, but that meant I was completely isolated. I didn't want to panic, but the evidence was there. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. For the next couple of hours, I tried to convince myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just some hikers or campers who had passed through. Maybe they had stayed the night, not realizing the cabin was occupied. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. The prints weren't from a casual walk. They were deliberate, heavy. They didn't look like someone passing through. They looked like someone who had been waiting. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. The thought of being alone in that cabin, with the strange noises and the footprints, was too much. I packed up my things quickly, more hastily than I would have liked. The whole time, I felt like someone was just outside the window, watching, waiting. The cabin felt suffocating now, like it had turned against me. I was halfway to my car when I heard it again, the soft scratching at the window. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The window was shut tight, the glass still. I quickly jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, desperate to leave. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, or worse, someone walking behind me in the woods. But there was nothing, just the winding road, the trees, and the empty miles stretching ahead. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where I finally felt some relief. The city seemed so far away, but the sense of safety that came with it was undeniable. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I had imagined it all. But the footprints, the noise, the strange feeling of being watched, it was real. I never went back to that cabin, but I've often wondered, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone, if someone was truly out there, waiting for me, or if it was something else entirely, something that the woods had claimed long before I ever arrived. I've always liked camping. Something about being out in the wild, far away from everything, felt like hitting a reset button. Life gets loud, and I've found that nature is the only place quiet enough to clear my head. That's why I decided to go solo this time. No friends, no conversations, just me and the woods. I planned it out carefully, a 2-night trip in a remote area up north, far enough from the usual crowded campgrounds. I had my tent, a sturdy backpack full of supplies, and a mapped-out route that I studied for hours beforehand. I wasn't new to this kind of thing. I'd been camping since I was a teenager. I knew how to read maps, how to purify water, how to stay calm when things went sideways. Or at least I thought I did. Started out fine. The hike to my campsite was about 6 miles in, mostly uphill but manageable. I reached a clearing around 3 p.m., set up my tent, and made a small fire to boil some water for dinner. The air smelled clean, the trees whispered in the wind, and everything felt right. No phone service, no distractions, just how I liked it. The first night passed without incident. The wind picked up a bit after midnight, rustling the leaves outside, but nothing unusual. I woke up once to the sound of something moving through the underbrush, but I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging for food. After a few minutes, the noise stopped, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came and I felt refreshed. I brewed some coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a stream about half a mile from my camp, so I hiked down to refill my water bottles. The water was cold and clear, and the forest felt alive around me. Birds called from the treetops, squirrels darted through the branches, and the sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. A shoe. It was lying near the edge of the stream, half buried in the mud. A men's hiking boot, scuffed and worn but still intact. It seemed out of place, too far from any trail, and there was no sign of its owner. I picked it up and looked around, but there was nothing else, just the boot. I set it back down and tried not to think too much about it. People lose things in the woods all the time, right? Maybe someone had passed through here months ago, lost their boot and kept going barefoot or with a spare. Still, it left an uneasy feeling in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I headed back to camp and spent the rest of the day sticking closer to my tent. I read a book, gathered some firewood, and tried to keep my mind busy. By the time the sun started to set, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Just a boot, no big deal. But that night, something changed. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard it again, that sound in the underbrush. It was soft at first, like something brushing against the leaves. Then it grew louder, moving closer to my camp. I froze. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and slow, circling just outside the reach of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped the second the light hit the trees. I sat there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything over the crackling of the fire. The woods had gone completely silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed in my tent, clutching my knife, every sound making my heart race. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. Something wasn't right. I packed up my gear, doused the fire, and started back toward the trailhead. I tried to move quickly, but not so fast that I'd miss my footing. The trail felt different now, darker, quieter. About 3 miles in, I found something else. A campsite, or what was left of one. There was a collapsed tent, torn open at the front, with the fabric flapping in the wind. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered. Nearby, there was a backpack with its contents spilled across the ground. Clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight with dead batteries. No people, no signs of a struggle, just abandoned. My pulse quickened. I scanned the area, but there was nothing else. No boot prints, no blood, nothing to tell me what had happened here. I debated whether to search the surrounding area, but my gut told me to keep moving. The rest of the hike was a blur. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the empty trail, and my own footsteps echoing in the silence. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt like I could breathe again. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a while, just listening to the hum of the engine. I didn't see anyone else in the parking lot. I never did find out what happened at that campsite. I told a ranger about it when I got back to town, but he just nodded and said they'd check it out. Part of me wanted to press for answers, but another part of me was relieved to leave it behind. That night, back in my apartment, I lay in bed replaying everything in my head. The boot by the stream, the footsteps in the dark, the abandoned tent. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation for all of it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong out there in those woods, and I'm not sure I'll ever go camping alone again.